for those of you who don't know, my name's Leah Levain. I'm co-chair of Jewish Voice for Labour, and I'm currently convening the JVL's anti-racist network. And we have had these, well, the education group coordinate JVL webinars, and they're roughly one organised by the education group, one by the environment group, and one by our group. So there'll be 9 or 10 seminars across the year, and this is our turn. So the anti-racing, and we've had most recently the webinars, our webinars have been around refugee issues and around race and class, and we felt it'd be good to have something that was particularly about anti-Black racism and what people are doing. And actually it was a complete coincidence, having chosen the subject of Windrush. I hadn't twigged when we planned this, that this was actually the same week as the 75th anniversary of the arrival. And it's a little bit galling to be seeing the celebrations, knowing what happened, I think is all I will say. And I'm going to set the scene a little bit. I'm assuming that you all know what happened to the Windrush generation in terms of how they got caught up in the extremities, if you like, of the hostile environment, so that the laws changed. So these are people who arrived usually as children or very young teenagers, usually following their parents who'd come. And so they traveled on parents' or brothers' passports, British passports, the blue British passports that we all had to fight so hard to get back. And they were British citizens at the time, but they never got any documentation because they didn't need any. And then they found themselves, when the law changed, I think it was a law in the 70s, changed their status, or rather changed the status for people who were in their position who traveled from that date. But when they were later wanting passports and unable to prove evidence, satisfactory evidence, that they had actually lived in this country since the 60s, 50s sometimes, they became illegals, and people who'd worked 30, 40 years, paid taxes, had education here, paid their national insurance, suddenly found they were entitled to nothing, lost jobs. It's awful. And our speaker, Jackie Walker, is not going to speak about any of that. And that's been left to me, and I'm not going to speak a great deal about that. And Jackie may say about why she's not going to speak about that, but she doesn't have to. She has very, very fascinating things. I just want to read something out. Some of you may remember that JVL, we organised a seminar, a webinar with Verso Press in partnership with the Haldane Society when the EHRC published their report on Labour in 2020. And Liz Fekete, who's someone from the Institute of Race Relations, spoke. I can't actually remember if she said this at the meeting or subsequently, but she wrote a fuller article following that. And I will just read that, and that's part of the context. So she said, the EHRC claims that the investigation into Labour was undertaken because of high levels of public concern. But the Equality Act of 2006 makes no mention that the instigator of an investigation should be public concern. This is a subjective concept open to media manipulation. And only 2 such concern-driven investigations were conducted between 2010 and 2018. Compare EHRC concern over anti-Semitism amongst members of the Labour Party to its timidity in the deployment of its enforcement powers over the institutional racism in the Home Office and the Windrush scandal. Compare the promptness on one investigation to the dilly-dallying on the other. Compare the fact that the one, i.e. the one is the Labour Party, was a full Section 20 investigation under the Equality Act 2006 to the other, far more limited public sector equality duty assessment. The Home Office's policies towards the Windrush generation, sorry, Jackie, resulted in at least 180 people being wrongfully deported, at least 11 of whom died before November 2018, and at least 9 more died after applying to the scheme, but before receiving any compensation. And countless others were made homeless or excluded from benefits. It was, in Sivanandan's important distinction, not so much about the racism that discriminates as the racism that kills. And yet, when the EHRC produced its report, even though it had the power to serve a compliance notice enforceable by the High Court, requiring action, it did not do so, merely recommending that the Home Office agree an action plan. And believe me, that upsets me, and I'm sure upsets all of us to hear that. And I just will make one more point before I hand over to Jackie, and there will be time, I promise you, for questions, contributions, etc. But we may think that this is a new thing, relatively new thing under the Tories, under Amber Rudd, or sorry, under Theresa May, who actually introduced the words hostile environment, and Amber Rudd, who eventually resigned but was enforcing it. But actually, after the war, when the Labour government, the one we laud, the Attlee government that we hear so many good things about, though I've been extremely worried for a long time, concerned about its failures on colonialism, that government was welcoming displaced Italians, Polish, and even German people, including German ex-soldiers who'd been prisoners of war, to come here and fill the labour shortage. And yet Attlee has been found, a memo from Attlee where he talks about the Windrush. This is a few hundred people coming from Jamaica as an incursion. So the hostile environment is not new. The Windrush is not an aberration. And I know this is really hard for all of us to hear, and it's especially hard for Jackie to hear, and she's going to explain why. Jackie's going to speak for up to half an hour, because we're going to have one speaker, which is unusual for us, but to give her plenty of time.
I thought I would start. I didn't want to spend this evening kind of trapped in a way in that discussion initially. I'm happy to go on with it after, but I didn't want to feel that my starting point was what's happening now. And neither did I want to, for my own personal, if you like, emotional reasons, want to set myself in that, because I have to tell you that particularly after what's happened, both politically and personally with me in the last, 7, 8 years or so, maybe a bit longer, I find it very, very difficult to actually deal with it. So what I wanted to start with was something that would give you an indication of why anti-Black Caribbean racism has some very unique and special characteristics, and why that fits in terms of how that affects Caribbean people. And like I say, what I'm talking about very specifically today is the people from the Caribbean, just so that everybody is assured of why I'm speaking. I am actually one of the youngest members of the generation that's called the Windrush generation. I arrived in Tilbury Docks in April 1959. So I am really going to speak about that strange phrase. I always feel a bit uncomfortable with that lived experience thing, but it's taken from my experience, but also my theoretical research on it. Now, one of the things about the peoples of the Caribbean, and that makes them different to all other colonial people in terms of the British Commonwealth, the old British Commonwealth and imperialism, is that what really makes them unique is that as a people, they were brought into existence by the actual act of colonialism. So this act of violence, of murder, of rape, of kidnapping, of enslavement, actually, if you like, made me possible. And so it kind of sets up, there's plenty of interesting academic papers that have been written on this as well. It kind of sets up a complex relationship between those who have been brought into existence by this imperial mother who has actually been the source of so much pain and difficulty. Now, if you can imagine how that continues when you actually experience returning to that imperial mother and finding that actually that promise that was given you, that after slavery, after enslavement, as the British Empire transformed into the Commonwealth, we would then not just part of the empire, but British passport holders. And yet what we found on coming here was yet another form of abuse, many of us. I think you can see that sets up a lot of complicated feelings, because for British Caribbean people, there is no other homeland. There is no place that we look to before colonization. There is the site of colonization, and there is what we were told was the motherland. That trauma, I believe, and I think there's plenty of evidence about this, has in part been why Black people from the Caribbean suffer so much from mental illness as a result of the racism that they receive. Not only that, but of course, the actual experience of enslavement, which meant that you couldn't speak your own language. So you couldn't communicate yourself, you couldn't write. So right up until, the end of enslavement, if anybody actually taught you to write, they ran the risk of being hung. And in fact, some Methodist preachers were hung for teaching slaves how to write. So we weren't given that tools of self-expression at all. And I think all of those issues about the way that Caribbean families, because of its enslavement, were separated, were ripped away from parents, often children being sold on, etc., tells you a lot about the very much unacknowledged trauma that Black people from the Caribbean have had. And what I would like to do then is start now with, if you like, a sort of personal journey. And I'm going to use for that a book which I wrote in 2008. I'm going to take some extracts from that and read to you now. And I'm also going to use a slideshow for some of it as well, and I will be talking through that. So this is the part where I actually describe what it was like to land in England as a 5-year-old. The men fastened the rope from the ship to the ground, lifting the stairway and fixing it down, and that was it. Just like that, we were joined to the land. Jackie shivered and shoved her hands into her pockets. The cold had seeped through every seam and buttonhole of her cotton dress, even before they stepped from the ship. This place, no blues or green, just every shade of grey she'd ever seen, and then some more besides. Jackie wiped her face and looked at her fingers. The dampness shimmered on her hand, and in the mustard glow of the streetlights, it seemed to the child as if her skin had taken on the same silver greyness of everything else around her. She looked up. There was her mother. She could barely see her. The fog had painted dark circles on her face where her eyes had once been. and every now and then great plumes of boiling steam gushed from her mouth and nose, so she looked like a dragon in the fairy books. Stay close to me, hold my hand. What a journey, Dorothy thought, as she stepped over the gutter. The children's faces seemed pale in the gloom. Where was the station? The baby kicked. She stroked her belly. The crossing had been nothing but a trial. All three of them, cramped up in such a small space, with her 4 months swelling and being sick every day, Lord. She looked at the suitcases piled up on the ground and felt all her hopes rising up again. This was it then, a home at last for her and the children, a new home in the old country, a new starting mother in the old motherland. She smiled and pursed her lips, picking up the battered suitcases that was marked with her name. A candle bit into her fingers. She hoped she wouldn't have to carry them too far, not too far, she hoped, before they got to the station. Dorothy narrowed her eyes and peered through the darkness. The street lamps dropped shallow pools of light around their stems, but the rest, something about this place. Was it the fog? Well, no, she'd expected that, but perhaps it was the solidness of the place that made it seem so strangely unfamiliar. She shook her head. Somehow she thought she'd know this England, this green and pleasant God save the Queen land of hopes and glory. But still it seemed strange. A man called out, "Evening paper," repeating his call, and she followed that voice, dipping her feet in the rhythm of his words, each line shining in her head as the words came back to her, those children's treasuries, poem for all, succulent verses that she knew so well, rolling her tongue on the James of it, the Wordsworth, Tennyson and Shakespeare of it. But however she tried, she just couldn't see the hosting of daffodils as a possibility. Not in these satanic streets, not in these smoke-blackened mills, no clouds of yellow gold to dissolve the flesh in. No, this place was flesh, flesh on the bone, not just the words, but the flesh and white bones of it all. Okay, so I'm now going to screen share. I hope I'm going to screen share. And I'm just going to take you through with some of the experiences. Okay, so on the top left-hand side, you can see that is the passport photo of me and my brother. And we were very unusual for Windrush migrants because we came here as children. Most people, of course, who migrate, and we know this today, really don't come with their children. They come to work. But my mother, for a number of reasons, she brought her children with her. But that set up for her and for us a whole load of difficulties. So, for example, in my Brixton primary school, we were the first Black children that there were there. And even when I then carried on up to university, you know, I was the only Black British person at my university. So it was always that sense of being the first. There wasn't a generation of Black people that was my age. In the middle, you can see a picture of my mother, just to give you that reference point. But on the right, and this is taken in a very famous Brixton photographers, what particularly people of Caribbean descent did was that they always sent back photos to the family back home to prove how well we were doing. And this was our photo. And I remember it was absolutely freezing cold getting on the bus to have this photo taken in this awful dress that just made my arms itch all the time. And of course, things weren't going well, but that was actually the last thing you were ever going to tell the people back home. So there's the book that I wrote. It was quite a shock to me, actually, by the way, when it got published. I never wrote it to be published. I wrote it because I felt that if I didn't write this down, the story for my children and my grandchildren and my descendants would be lost forever. And in fact, I still think it is the only memoir of a child coming as part of the Windrush generation. I was extremely lucky. If you go on, for example, the BBC, you'll see that there was Woman's Hour interview, and it was in The Guardian, it was in all sorts of newspapers, but it was quite a shock to get it published. So that's where I took that extract from. So this is me, 1959, and this photo tells you something, because here I am in the other photo, which is being sent to my mother to tell her that we're all right, because what my mother did was what a lot of Jamaicans did. Now it's a bit of, this bit's a bit complicated because we didn't come directly from Jamaica to England. We came via Canada. My mother went to Canada, first of all, to try and get work. And then she called us and we followed her to Canada, and we actually came to England on a boat from Canada. So on this photo, this is Jackie being told to smile. And you can see I was probably just about as biddable then as I am now. And the last thing I was going to do was smile, because I felt totally miserable. My mother had left me when I was 3.5. I was now 4.5. I missed her terribly. Many of the young people who came during that Windrush time also experienced this. And this went on well into the 70s, that children who had been left in the Caribbean were being brought over here. By that time, I was a teacher in London, and I know that many of our children I was teaching had been traumatized by first being left at home and then being brought here to a country they didn't know, and actually to parents they didn't know. So this in itself tells that story of being told to smile. This is my grandfather and my uncle. Now, we're all given, aren't we, stereotypes of Black people coming over to this country, that they're poor, that they're uneducated, that they live in the cities. Of course, everybody's got an individual story. My grandfather was actually called Teacher Walker, and he was a very prominent educationalist on the island. And many of the Jamaicans who came over here were actually well educated. Jamaica had a reputation for having two things with quite a high standard. One was nutrition, and the other one was a high level of education. One thing I remember was my mother actually explaining to a social worker once that she had gone to university. Later on, when I got my social work records, that social worker had written down that my mother had delusions because she believed that she had gone to university. And I think, I think that's another thing that many people from the Windrush were faced with, that people just felt that they knew what they were and who they were, and they didn't have the opportunity to actually explain that for themselves. I've really put this here because this is my great grandmother. I mean, one of the reasons I don't tell the names of my great-grandmother, who's actually got a Jewish name, is because of that awful controversy that happened around, you know, Jackie Walker claims to be Jewish sort of thing. You can see she was a pretty fearsome woman, and she had long, very straight hair, even to this age, that went down to her bottom. She was looking after me right into her 80s. And that, for me, is an important issue, because if you think, so she was in her 80s, in the 60s. And so her mother was actually born on the edge of that slavery sort of apprenticeship system. And I remember somebody saying to me, oh yeah, but you know, all of that slavery thing that happened to you, it wasn't 50 years ago, you know, it was a long time ago. Well, I was brought up by a woman whose mother was actually enslaved. So for many of us, it is actually that close, and that trauma is that close. And here you have, this is, you know, the picture on the far right, that's my mother, the little brown face peeking out at the side. That's me, and this is my brother. The only black faces here, oh, I think there's another one round the corner there. And as you can see, our experiences were different. And actually, because my mother had children and she wasn't coming to family here, we were already isolated, both from our community and from the white community. And for me, this photo really represents that real isolation that many people of the Windrush generation felt during that time, that sort of, who are you and what are you doing here? We arrived at Waterloo, and as you can see, one thing that people always commented on is how beautifully people are dressed. But the thing I want to point to is the fact that, as you can see, there aren't any children there. Very, very few children. The people who are coming are working age people, and they're coming, of course, to work on the buses, and they're coming, of course, to work in the hospitals. And they're coming because Enoch Powell went to the Caribbean and said, please come, please come. The homeland really needs you to come and help us because we haven't got enough workers after the war. And people came here in the expectation that they would be welcomed and that they were wanted. That is the countering, that was the countering picture. So you got the kind of false picture of how we were sort of made up to look like, to center the relatives. But this was like how it really was. You can see my, what we call nappy hair and my ribbon hanging out. And that's me and my brother in Brixton in 1960. And of course, what happened in Brixton was, you know, the reason why people actually settled initially in Brixton was how the train system worked and where you had to sign on. So the nearest place that you could sign on for work was around the Clapham area. And so people initially went to that area of London, and Brixton, being the cheapest place, was where people settled. We very soon moved out of Brixton and went to Southeast London, which is actually where I still live today. And here you have, this was life. Latchkey kid on the council estate in Greenwich. And my mother at that time was working in the post office, and we would go to school, get ourselves off to school, come back from school and get ourselves dinner, having picked up my little brother from nursery. Now, a lot of children, of course, do that, but I suppose I'm pointing to that because when you have no relatives and no structures around you of support, that in fact leaves you as a family extremely vulnerable. And that vulnerability for us was really put under stress when in 1965, my mother died and we were all taken to a children's home. And again, almost all the people in the children's home were white. Nobody really knew what to do with us. Certainly nobody knew what to do with my hair. And so it carries on, this issue about being that Windrush generation, those first people. So that's a little sort of jet-propelled initiation in 20 minutes, half an hour, of how my life sort of set me up for being where I am now. And of course, England has been a home to me. And I have found a way of making a home in England. But there's always a cost to that experience. And the cost for me has been personal and it's been emotional. And I find it very difficult to speak about these so-called commemorations or celebrations that are going on now. Because to me, when I see the service at Westminster Abbey, when I see the royal family, when I see Keir Starmer giving his thoughts about how important the Windrush generation is, while enforcing a sort of hierarchy of racism, I just find it impossible to sort of deal with. That doesn't mean I'll find it impossible to speak to you about it. So if you have more questions, any questions that you want to discuss, I'm very happy to take them.
Jackie, thank you so much. Yes, I think there's lots to be drawn from what you've shared, and thank you for being so open about your own story.